I've been working on this in this field for a long time, and I never dreamed when I started working on this topic about 15 years ago, I suppose, that I would ever be spending, which I have now, a decade focused on this question of electromagnetic fields and health. So I wrote a book in 2010 called Disconnect, The Truth About Cell Phone Radiation. The book was published in 2010. I find it hard to imagine. There's not one word of it that I would change now. And it's the previous book I wrote, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, ended with the suggestion that we really needed to know more about electromagnetic fields and especially cell phones. And the pushback I got from that book convinced me that I really had to do this Disconnect book. The electromagnetic spectrum goes all the way from power lines to radioactive waste and cosmic rays. As you can see here, you'll see that the power lines in the US and Europe are at 50 hertz and 60 hertz. Phones generally, up till now, have used between 800 megahertz up to 2400 megahertz. Routers, of course, can use the full range, and smart meters, frankly, go from 0.9 to 2.45 gigahertz, which would be 900 megahertz to 2450 gigahertz. So these numbers immediately get baffling to most people. I start with a very basic fact that a cell phone is a two-way microwave radio. When people are aware of that, as said in that way, they immediately understand that they need to take some precautions. Cell phones are weaker than microwave ovens because a microwave oven uses 1,000 watts of power, and a phone can use less than 1 watt of power. So it gets really confusing very fast because, of course, cell phones cannot pop popcorn and microwave ovens can. But the reality is it's not the power of the phone that we're concerned about, but the pulse. And the pulse is much more complex than the power because it includes the information that is put onto the frequency and sent typically at an irregular, erratic pace. So it's the irregular pulse over thousands of minutes and thousands of hours and many months and many years that can be damaging for the long term. And there are some people who are exquisitely sensitive to this, and they experience adverse effects much more immediately. But the spectrum itself is very broad. It includes the indoor environment where the 60 hertz and 50 hertz is particularly relevant and important to make sure that buildings are up to code and make sure that they're adequately shielded. But there also should be shielding and protection from RF exposure. And we believe that whenever possible, RF emitting and dependent devices should be wired. And it is possible to do that. I am speaking to you today from my newly acquired wired PC, which has a USB, which then goes into an Ethernet connector, which then goes into the router. So there's no Wi-Fi being used for this presentation. The next slide shows you what the current testing system looks like for microwave radiation. And that is a system that was first devised, amazingly enough, in 1996 and continues to be used today. I find that extraordinary. This is over 2-decade-old standard that relies on science that is 3 decades old and only avoids short-term heating. The American Academy of Pediatrics, numerous scientists with whom Environmental Health Trust works, have repeatedly advised the agency that the standards do not adequately protect children and pregnant women, and I will show you shortly a few examples of that. And yet that advice has been ignored. So we are left with this dependency on this outdated system that basically takes an empty bowling ball of a human head of a guy weighing about 220 pounds. And it takes that head and pours into it fluid that is homogeneous. Those of you who know anything about the brain understand that the brain contains many components of different densities, but the entire test system is based on a homogeneous brain avoiding heating. and with a dipstick that goes into it, computer guided, as you can see at the top, and gives a readout about what 6 minutes of exposure would do in terms of heating parts of the brain. That is an outdated and outmoded approach, and many other international groups and agencies and governments have independently concluded that that is an inadequate way to protect the public. The International Agency for Research on Cancer of the World Health Organization, which we still belong to for one more year, although the president has withdrawn us from it, concluded that all non-ionizing radiation from electromagnetic fields were a possible human carcinogen. That was in 2011. They did that based on animal and human research. In 2001, earlier, they concluded that magnetic fields from power lines also were a possible human carcinogen. And what I would say is that these outdated reviews by the International Agency for Research on Cancer have now been subsumed by more recent science. I'm just going to show you two examples. The next slide is a summary of studies done by the National Toxicology Program of the US government, which is the flagship program for studying effects in animals in order to predict effects in humans. I would take a minute and say this. Every agent that we know can cause cancer in humans will produce it in animals when adequately studied. That is the whole premise for pharmacology and drug development. We study things in animals in order to predict them in humans and try to prevent them from happening. In a detailed study that was the state of the art, conducted by the National Toxicology Program and released over a period of years, starting in 2016 now to 2019, those scientists who did that study, which cost almost $30 million, concluded that there was clear evidence of cancer and DNA damage from exposure to cell phone radiation that did not induce heating. So the study was designed very carefully. It has been subject to a phenomenally strange review and rejection by the same US government that did the study. And Theodora will tell you more about what has gone on there. But keep in mind that there's clear evidence of cancer and evidence of DNA damage. And just as an example, we'll go to the next slide that shows you the electromagnetic field exposure during pregnancy in animals and what this did to the offspring. Now, the control slides on your left of the screen show you an intact cells. If you look carefully, you'll see circles. Those are cell membranes, and you see many of them. That's what healthy cells look like in the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that is critical to memory and impulse control and learning. These animals then were exposed prenatally to cell phone radiation that did not induce heat. And I published some results with my colleagues in Turkey in 2016. Others have subsequently also shown the same effect, which is the controls you see with the intact cells. If you look closely to the exposed cells on your right, the granular cells are condensed and you will see fewer of them. This is for the same relative area. They're missing brain cells and there's more damage in them. That's clear evidence from that study. These are two different studies here that have been done with the same results. Many others have confirmed this kind of effect from prenatal exposure, including Dr. Hugh Taylor at Yale showed in 2012 that prenatally exposed animals were more hyperactive, had poorer memories, and altered brain function. Studies have actually been done also on humans, and those studies done at UC LA University of California School of Public Health found more behavioral problems in children who had higher exposure of their mothers during pregnancy. And Kun Lee has also done an unusual study where he's been able to track exposures to magnetic fields during pregnancy and showed a higher risk of miscarriage, and that children who were born have higher risks of obesity, asthma, and damage to their thyroid. So there's a number of important studies there that, again, have been ignored by the FCC in its recent review of the evidence. The next slide shows you what Dr. Anthony Miller and I and other epidemiologists concluded by looking at all of the relevant data published since the 2011 review by IARC. And this study was produced by us in 2018, and subsequent studies have been produced by Hardell and Karlberg and Peleg and Kelly, all showing that if you look at all of the evidence combined, that is both human studies, often case control, as well as animal data, such as the one I just showed you from the National Toxicology Program and from my colleagues in Turkey, if you combine all of those studies together, considering both recent animal experimental studies and human studies, radiofrequency radiation should be classified as as a human carcinogen. And then I want to add in the next slide that cancer is really just the tip of the iceberg. The published research on electromagnetic fields includes all of those items listed below: damage to DNA, memory and brain damage, damage to sperm, human sperm as well as animal sperm, combined effects, synergistic effects, including headache, problems with sleep, and increased oxidative stress, which are markers of damage. In addition, we have really ignored the impact on bees and trees. And these are substantial and worrisome and really should be addressed, particularly given the planned build out of 5G, which would involve exposures that are without precedence and have never been studied for their effects on the environment. Never. So the next slide, I will briefly just mention, was the side of magnetic field exposure during pregnancy that I mentioned from Kun Lee, finding the increase in miscarriage, and then following up the children showing the increase in asthma and obesity. And all of these studies, we can give you links to all of them so that you can follow up. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them, but I'm almost done with this part of the talk. So radiofrequency radiation can be, is an issue that's been very challenging to understand in terms of cell phone towers themselves. This study here was done by a very capable group in India. And what they did is they looked in the blood for people who lived within 80 meters and over 300 meters from a tower, controlling for their exposure to cell phones and other devices. And they showed significant biological effects in damage in the blood to antioxidant status, which is to say reduced antioxidants, and you want to have antioxidants because they're critical to developing and fighting off all kinds of things, including cancer-causing agents. And they also showed a decline in glutathione, which is, again, a very important enzyme used in detoxification, and superoxide dismutase, which is important for detoxification as well. So there is this study, there are not that many of these studies because it's not been possible to do such a well-designed study, but they did do this in India, and they did conclude that there was significant DNA damage in the blood of people who lived closest to the towers. American Cancer Society recently sponsored a study in 2020 finding in a case-controlled design a doubled risk of thyroid cancer in those using phones who carried a certain genetic mutation, and that mutation, pardon me a minute, that mutation was clearly a common mutation. So with that common mutation, they were able to see a doubled or greater risk of thyroid cancer associated with cell phone use. And finally, in an appeal to the United Nations and the European Union, the next slide, Theodora, shows that over 400 experts from 42 nations have petitioned the United Nations concluding that the publications show the damage I've just shown you, and asking for a moratorium on 5G until the non-industry research can be conducted to ensure the safety of the public. The final slide, final two slides of my talk are a summary of what the insurance industry has done. And I should think this would be a wake-up call to all of those who are asking you to build things in the environment. The Swiss Re has issued a number of papers, including most recently a white paper prior to COVID, in which they concluded that 5G would be off the leash, a polite term for saying that there was no way to estimate its full dangers. And the danger with electromagnetic fields, in Lloyd's of London said, is that the exposure is underestimated and could grow exponentially, and that the effects could be like those of asbestos in their ability to bankrupt the insurance industry. So the insurance industry will not cover EMF. It's excluded as a pollutant. And therefore, the telecom industries are self-insured. I think this is a pretty important fact that should be brought to the attention of your builders. And finally, the Harvard Press issued this report by Norman Alster, concluding that the Federal Communications Commission is a captured agency, and that consumer health has often been subsumed and sacrificed because of the unchecked industry influence. That I suggest you might find that very interesting reading. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Theodora.
And the paper which I'm sending to you is the paper in Building and Environment. And what that details is how all of these effects, which Deborah's talked about, have been found at levels below our regulatory limits. There's a variety of limits that we have in terms of what cell towers, what the emissions of cell towers are allowed to be in different countries. And as well, there's actually different limits in relation to the phones. And they are two separate kinds of limits. And it is quite technical and complicated actually, but for the 900 megahertz, if you can see, the United States allows, in terms of what's allowed to be in the air, the environmental levels, among the highest, along with many other countries actually, in the world. And there's several European countries that have lower limits set for precaution, whereas China and Russia have set them based on knowledge of biological effects at non-thermally relevant levels. And India dropped their levels to 1/10 of what they were after doing a review of the impacts to birds and bees. And we have a page on our website at ehtrust.org on international actions where you can learn more about that and see what all the different countries are doing. I can't go into this, but I wanted to point a few things out. This is just a very, just some examples. And that is that there are, such as Russia and actually over a dozen countries, have very strict limits or policies related to the amount of magnetic field EMF allowed near homes or new construction or schools. And then different countries have different regulations related to Wi-Fi, which is banned in nursery schools in several countries or restricted in France and Israel. And there's a variety of different laws moving forward. It's changing all the time, and we try to keep up and update our website pretty regularly if you're interested in that. And then there are countries where they are loosening regulations. So just the basics before I go in depth, and I don't know if you can see in my house, we have all of these things, like a corded phone. But in design, in terms of where the location is, keeping it at a distance from high EMF sources like power lines or cell antennas or substations. And then internally, in terms of all your systems, you want to choose low EMF or no RF, not the wireless security system, even with HVAC. And we just moved into a house. We have redone the entire HVAC. I've been personally deep in this road, actually. We put in all hardwired connections in the wall with an electrician. We have an off switch for a lot of our electricity in the bedrooms, as well as some things which are in metal cables to decrease the electric fields. So you want to think about having phones. If you're going to have wired phones, all of this needs to be planned in advance. And then kind of at a minimum, having that low EMF sleeping area where everything can be turned off. Have a minimal use of wireless in the building or in your home, and creating a low EMF computing workstation for where we do all of our work. I am on the computer all day long, more than I should be, but it's all as low as possible for me. And I also have a switch plate here. This is like what we have in our house. So we have both the phones. I have 2 phone lines, and we have 2 Ethernets. And I always recommend having 2 or 3 or more Ethernets for every room, just because I've got 2 kids, and one line is not enough. If I were to do it over again, I'd do that in every room. So the Collaborative for High Performance Schools in 2014 came out with criteria, and I'm going to go over that. It's in the paper, and I think it's pretty much the basics. To measure, you want to measure and have the ELF, magnetic fields, at a level that is lower than that's linked to childhood leukemia. So for the Collaborative for High Performance Schools, they have 1 milligauss for new construction, 2 milligauss for existing. In many cases, if you have high magnetic fields, that can be addressed by fixing common wiring errors. And I'll send that to everyone so you can pass that along. Of course, if you're near a power line, that's a different ballgame, and there's not really a way to address that. And we have no limits in the United States on magnetic fields at all. And the fields that were linked in the Kaiser Permanente research that Deborah talked about were about at 3. So this is an area that we really need to address in the United States. I just conversed with the EPA that confirmed they have not looked at this since 1980s. And this is a gaping hole in accountability, among other issues. So positioning, especially in schools, supply rooms, the building power, where all the electrical stuff is going to be, should not be near where you are living most of the time. Even in our house, I specifically chose this house because all of the electrical, all those components were in near where the bathrooms were in terms of the 3 levels, and it was as far away as possible from where we were sleeping. In California, after the research that they did, which has been terminated and defunded for many years now, they do have the guidelines for the Department of Education with setbacks for power lines, actually. In terms of your computers, and there's like this connection between the building and also what people do in the building, because you can have everything low EMF in terms of magnetic fields, but then you have kids in schools who place those laptops on their lap, as I did for years, not knowing that that would be not a good idea, right on the abdomen, right on your reproductive organs, and you're going to get magnetic fields and electric fields from that laptop, even if it's hardwired. So the devices need to be on the table. There's all of this lifestyle and behavioral work that needs to be done, maybe signs posted about, here's how you use your devices. All the equipment should come with Ethernet ports and a physical switch to disable the wireless. There's a wired internet system, as I talked about, throughout the building. There have been a lot of discussions, glad to talk at another time, about how do you hardwire an office? How do you hardwire, and I mean with a lot of people. Of course, all offices were always hardwired previously, and in secure settings, they're always hardwired because it's faster, safer, and more secure to be going through a wire rather than through wireless. But in the schools, it really does present a challenge. There are schools that are hardwiring, and we had a presentation by the IT chief of Haifa in Israel talking about how he did it. We have those plans up on our website at ehtrust.org as well. And wired phones, which I talked about. And also just remember that cordless phones, like, I don't know if you can see in my little picture, but decked phones like this also emit radio frequency radiation. And often, I know what I found out when I got a meter was that, in fact, my biggest source was this right in my face all day at my office. And so now we have a corded phone with a cord in all of our rooms. In terms, I think you're already aware of this, but in terms of a low EMF sleep sanctuary, not having screens, wireless and electronics, TVs, all of that, not in the bedroom. Also, not having electrical cords running underneath the bed or situating those electrical points so that they're not going to be, you're not going to have like all these lines and lamps and all of this, which has all this electricity running. There are special little on-off switches you can put, as well as Christmas timers on lamps. I use a low blue light reading lamp at night to read, which I like to do. Don't forget about gaming consoles, battery-powered alarm clock, and no screens at least at really 2 hours before bedtime. I can't say that I always follow that myself because I'm always working, but I do have blue light protection on my screens. I use both the internal software to reduce the flicker in the blue light, as well as an external screen with, I have a couple kinds. One is 100% blue light blocking and some are partial, depending on what I'm doing. We're not even touching blue light, but that's a whole critical issue, and we have a lot of that on our website as well. You don't want to have the utility meters and the electrical panels near the bedroom, especially on the other side of the wall. And there's also the demand switch, and I wish my house was pre-wired with the breakers and all of this situated. And also addressing dirty electricity in terms of the motors that are chosen for the machinery in the house. And I'm just going to briefly touch on that, but no dimmers. Instead, use regular on-off switches. Light bulbs is really an issue, and this raises a critical situation, which is that energy efficient is right now not the same as low EMF, and this needs to be addressed. So that's going to require our business organizations to be addressing this with the companies so that they can make safer technology. A lot of the new LEDs, they're getting better, but the recommendation from building biologists is they really need to be tested in terms of flicker and blue light, as well as harmonics, which would be sometimes called dirty electricity, where you have different frequencies running on the line. And so addressing solar power inverters with high quality filters, which is another issue that absolutely has to be addressed. So I know people who have special filtering, especially for what they have in their home, having a power strip, and I talked about some of these. So I just was going to end here and say that there needs to be professional measurements when you do shielding and mitigation, because you can have a situation where you think you're shielding from a source, but you're actually reflecting from a source that's over here, which you're not aware of. And if you have a $200 meter or even a $500 meter, which is better than the more less expensive ones, you're not going to catch everything that's going on. Sometimes you really have to analyze more completely the situation before shielding. I have a lot of concerns about using shielding paint in situations where people are not fully educated, and they might put shielding paint on and then walk in with their cell phone. So their cell phone's going to go to high power when you have you got this low signal because you just shielded your entire bedroom. So that's why if you can make the bedroom be a place, but when you shield it, it has to be, you can't be using wireless in it. And again, we recommend professional support in that always. And the Institute for Building Biology I have the website there, buildingbiologyinstitute.org, and electricians with EMF expertise I would recommend as a resource.